Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on empowering every student in your class with universal design for learning.
I'm Chris Zegar. I am one of your presenters, and I am here with
Marc Cicchino. So this session was obviously originally intended to happen in person. We've tried to transition many of the in-person parts and interactive parts to something that's a little more accessible in this kind of online asynchronous format. Chris and I will be interacting with each other in places where we may have been asking you to interact with your colleagues or your fellow participants. But that's what this is in a nutshell. So.
All right, so here we are. So our plan for this session is this. The first part is really try to get you to become familiar with the UDL process, what it is, what it isn't. So I'll stress here that UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, is not differentiation, but differentiation is in there. We're also going to try to not only give you an idea of what UDL is, but also get you a variety of resources that you can use so that you feel a little bit more comfortable implementing a universal design for learning sequence within your classes. So the other part of this too is to actually kind of look at it not only as the educator, but we'll also try to give you an understanding of what those problems look like when they come from a student, and how to best weave universal design for learning into what comes, or basically how to harvest student perspective when you're building in a UDL framework.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, even though it isn't embedded in our plan explicitly here, we'll also talk about how universal design actually affects us every day as human beings. You know, walking down the street, there are plenty of things, you know, in architecture that have been universally designed that just enhance our experience interacting with the world today. So we'll talk a bit more about that. Who are these guys?
Yeah, this is us before the apocalypse. Before more beard and Corona haircuts. So I am Chris Zegar. I am the Director of Research Planning and Evaluation at the Roxbury Township School District in Northern New Jersey. I work specifically with teachers in how to craft basically specific types of lessons that reach all different types of learners.
And I'm Marc Cicchino, Director of Innovation at Northern Valley Regional High School District. So I spend a lot of time in curriculum and instruction and assessment and technology. And I also teach at Rutgers, and most recently I've been teaching online. And I think that that may lend itself to some of the conversation we'll be having here, especially as many of us have shifted to just an entirely remote or a sudden remote online environment. But I think that'll inform some of the discussion here as well.
Okay. Yeah, you can go with this. Go for it.
What's your problem?
All right.
So yeah. Originally, the game plan was to ask everyone who was attending this session to consider a problem that they had in their practice, in their teaching, in their instruction, something that they see their students struggle with, or something that perhaps students find challenging that is frustrating for us as teachers, educators, instructors. So what we were going to do is ask you to identify and discuss a problem of practice, to identify specific barriers, and this is where we start to get into what UDL really is, to identify specific barriers to learning that exist within that problem for an individual student, right? So first think of what the challenge is, what's the frustrating thing, and then to reframe that as what's the barrier that is preventing that student from accessing the learning that sometimes presents itself to us as a frustration or a challenge or a struggle. Then to consider how those barriers might be removed for that individual student. And then this is, the critical piece that makes this universal design, to consider how that strategy or that thing, that intervention, that whatever we want to call it, that you might put in place for that one student could potentially be scaled to the entire class, right? How might that fix?
I'm going to jump in on this part, because I think that's something that really you want to reflect back on. So when you're thinking about the problem you have, there are general real world problems that you have with your students. Anything from, disorganized kids to students who are having difficulty being able to deal with the amount of work or the type of work in an online setting. And instead of thinking about like, okay, how do I solve each of these problems for each of these individual students? Trying to reframe that as, hey, what is the barrier that's stopping a student from being able to access the type of information and the type of learning we want. And then if I can find that barrier and I can remove that barrier, is removing that barrier actually going to make everybody's life, every student I have, life a lot easier and allow them to access more learning during that process?
Yep. Yep. Awesome. So instead of asking you to turn and talk and share your problems, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of our problems. Specifically, I'm going to start to unpack and talk about one of my problems. And I think a lot of this will feel organic because I haven't shared this problem in detail with Chris yet. So you'll hear us start to just work through using UDL as a framework, how you could potentially consider a problem through that lens. So here's a problem that I have. So I'm teaching an online class this semester. I was teaching an online class this semester, and a handful of students have been really struggling with staying on top of their assignments and their deadlines in the online environment. So, these are otherwise students who are great writers. They turned in an essay. I'm thinking about one student in particular, turned in an essay. It was, perhaps the best essay I received in the class. Clearly someone who is a strong student, a strong writer, and academically has it together, but for some reason in the online environment is missing deadlines, is having a tough time staying on top of assignments. And there are quite a few students who are in that boat. So that's my problem. The next part here would be to try and consider what specific barriers to learning might exist for that student or those students. Chris, do you have any ideas?
So what we're looking at here is a handful of students really struggling to stay on top of their assignments. And we could do is we could talk, what I would do is I would start looking at it of what are the key features here of this problem, right? So where might the barriers end up forming? So I would look here and say, okay, we're talking about staying on top of assignments, which means, like they're having trouble making deadlines, right? So this could fit into issues of self-regulation. It could fit into issues of just basically a different type of environment than they're used to, which may not specifically be a self-regulation issue. It might be something along the lines of representation or feeling removed from a group, right? Because this is an online environment. So there are other things that these students are going to have to look at. So is this an issue now where maybe students have a really good organizational method when they meet with you in class, but maybe when we move online, maybe that organizational method is completely thrown out of whack, right? So there's a couple things that maybe we should look at. Is this the way information is presented? Is this a way that a student has to relearn how to organize themselves at home? And then we can play around with that.
Yeah, so that's really helpful. I started to jot some of those ideas down. I don't even remember what the next slide is actually, so that's good. So, and I'll share with, and I think some of this might be on there, but I'm not positive. But just to kind of go over what Chris just shared and a few other things I added as I was taking notes. What is the barrier here? Is it that a student might be having an issue organizing him or herself? So is it as straightforward as organizational skills, right? So the organizational skills that may be translated well, or that student has been, really refining over the course of their entire academic career in person, suddenly looks different when it's online, right? You're used to going into class, maybe you bring in an agenda with you or a calendar, and so you've got a process, but as soon as you're online, then organization looks a little bit different. Could it be a matter of how I'm presenting the information, right? So if they're used to seeing it on a board or spoken, but I'm sending it in online, and I think everyone's doing it differently. So there are instructors who might just be emailing their information out. There are, assuming you're on Canvas, right? If you're at Rutgers, or you're using any kind of LMS, maybe you're housing it there, but even within different learning management systems, there are like a dozen or more ways to convey or communicate information. Are you sending it through messages? Are you posting it as an assignment? Are you using modules? Are you using announcements to communicate it, right? So, and if everyone is doing it differently, it's really tough for kids, for students, no matter how old they are, to perhaps organize that and manage that. So is it how I'm presenting it? Could it be time management, on a student's behalf? Are they able to manage their time or their schedule as well now that everything's been hoisted online, or perhaps they're taking an online course for the first time? And oh, I was trying to decode I've been writing with a crayon here. So executive function, right, is the other thing. And Chris, you started to mention that. So yeah, so there are a number of possible barriers here. So we'll move on to the next slide. Possible barriers. Some of this stuff is here. Great, awesome. So time management skills, high demand across an entire course load. I think that's something that is unique to the COVID situation, where we've seen students' entire schedules translate into online learning, and that looks different depending on the instructor's comfort level. So, is everyone, are students suddenly having live Zoom sessions that they're required to attend on top of heaped on readings and videos to watch and modules? Is there more work to manage than there was before? Or maybe that isn't the problem. Maybe it is organizational in nature. So the next part would be for us to consider how those barriers might be removed. And it might be helpful, Chris, if we just pick one of those barriers and try and consider.
I think the easiest one to look at here is probably organizational skills, because there's probably a lot of things that an educator can do without really overwhelming themselves that could probably help a student. So if that student is having trouble making deadlines, there might be some ways that you can chunk so here's just throwing out some ideas, and it does, some ideas work with some assignments, some ideas won't. So chunking works with some assignments, right? Having students have smaller deadlines of smaller work, so that they don't feel like they're disconnected for a long period of time on their own, because they're no longer in your class. So a lot of students need that touch point where they where they know they're in your class, and it reminds them of what they're supposed to do. So having students have smaller deadlines more often might help. Changing the way that you have a calendar. Maybe instead of having the syllabus where the student's expected to check, maybe you move those syllabus deadlines to a Google Calendar, which then can give reminders to students as they get closer to an assignment. It could be something as, another way you could do it too is maybe you change how you take some of the online and bring it home. Sometimes students stay on top of things through discussion with classmates, and maybe creating small cohorts within your class of classmates, so that they can bounce ideas off each other, and then they'll remind each other of upcoming deadlines.
So I'm taking notes in crayon. But to kind of just go over what you should there, and I think all three of these are great strategies, right? And they all attack the barrier from different angles, and the best way to start would probably be to try one of these strategies. You try that way in, that angle, and if it works and you scale it, and that's the next thing we'll talk about, and it's effective for, it helps more than one student, then you're doing it. And a lot of this stuff, I think we're doing already. I think you'll start to hear it in the first example here, right? So what I heard was chunking the deadlines, right? So if you've got a research paper, you've got something that's due in a week, whatever it might be, instead of just saying, all right, turn this in 2 weeks, creating little check-ins along the way, or breaking the assignment down, the assessment down into smaller pieces. So that's something that, I know in K-12 land happens frequently, right? When you essentially create like an individualized plan for success for a kid, if they're struggling with something, very easy to imagine sitting down with a student and saying, okay, let's work through how you can ultimately get to this endpoint here, right? Let's make this more manageable. If I teach research writing class, if a 10-page paper seems like a totally daunting and overwhelming thing, instead of thinking of it that way, think of it as 5 2-page deadlines, right? And that could potentially make it much more manageable. Some of our strongest students do that on their own, and I think something that we probably do on our own without even thinking, how can we help students to manage their time or organize how they tackle an assignment, is we do this. I know that in that research writing course that I teach, there are 4 rough drafts that's consistent across the department. It does exactly this, right? So that's a great strategy. Another that you mentioned, Chris, was creating a calendar, right? So essentially changing the um, the formatting or the way that information that might be presented via syllabus or via Canvas is presented, right? Maybe putting it into something a little more user-friendly, like a calendar. And the other thing you mentioned was changing even the modality of the work, right? Making it collaborative, exploring small group stuff. Yeah, great. That's it. So, and then the next piece is considering how that solution could be scaled to fit the entire class. So if there's a student who, if you hear like a tea kettle, that's my 11-month-old squealing in the background. There it is, right? Can you hear it? Can you hear it, Chris? Is he
I can hear it. I can hear my son or daughter will probably at some point in time run in here and try to jump on my lap. So when that happens, you might see me, kind of usher them out a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
I always think of that, like that news clip, was it CNN or NBC, where the like little kid in the walker breaks into the room.
Oh yeah, and they're trying to keep pulling the
Yes.
back out, right? Yeah. The wife just keep trying to pull the kid
out. But as far as trying to consider how we might then scale this, and this is how we essentially take, the strategy here of universal design for learning is, we find the barrier, we consider how we might surmount that barrier, maybe for an individual student, but then scale that and make that accessible to all students, right? Why withhold that one strategy that's working well for one kid when it could really be to the benefit of everyone in the class?
and I'm going to interrupt here because I think that's an enormously important point when it comes to why I think a lot of us really believe in UDL as a realistic model for lots of different types of teaching, because what we're talking about here is creating an ecosystem that reinforces itself for all learners, instead of trying to create an individualized learning plan for every single learner in class, which is, in reality, when you start to scale up, is almost impossible once you get past like 10 kids.
Yeah, and the metaphor that, so CAST really champions the work of UDL, and the metaphor that they'll use is the dinner party metaphor, right? So if you're you're hosting Thanksgiving, let's say, and you try and make everybody happy and give everybody what they need. Maybe you're preparing a turkey, but your sister-in-law is coming and she's a vegetarian. So, Chris, what do we prepare for her?
We are going to make a tofu turkey specifically for her.
Tofurkey.
Yes, a tofurkey, right? Just for her. That'll be that won't be overwhelming, right? Like that.
Right. So you toss that into the mix, and maybe it's manageable if that's the only other thing that you're going to start to juggle. But your uncle's coming, and he has been gluten-free for 2 weeks. New kick, but he lets you know, hey, I'm gluten-free. So if you could do anything to accommodate that, that'd be great. So you start to consider how you might make a special dish for him, and you've got someone else. Essentially, the more of these individual dishes you try and prepare, you become a restaurant. And if you are in a restaurant, which you're not, we're one person, there's only so much you can juggle. And even if you pull it off, and it's more likely that you don't, you forget the tofurkey in the trunk of the car and realize you ruined Thanksgiving for your sister-in-law. But even if you do pull it off, it's not sustainable. That's not something you can do every day and hold on to your sanity. The pitch that comes with universal design, tea kettle, is that comes with universal design is that instead of trying to manage a dinner party where you individualize meals for everyone, you create a buffet, right? You make everything available to everybody. You have a tray of green beans, a tray of tofu casserole, a tray of turkey, and your brother who's a carnivore who makes fun of people who eat tofu might put some tofu on his plate, find that he loves it and eats more tofu than ever before. So yeah, that's really that UDL distinction in a nutshell. But translating some of these, these strategies we discussed from something that might benefit one student to an entire class, when I think of like the calendar, I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? So it's something that a lot of learning management systems do on their own. There are calendars built into them. In a bit, I'll talk about how one way I did that using a Google Doc I'll share. But that's pretty straightforward, right? Instead of just kind of printing that out, that's something we would have done years ago, print it out, give it to one student and say, here you go. Maybe you open the door for everybody to access that. Same for, collaboration, same for other modalities to get something done. If you're asking the kids to do your students to do a presentation, and you're requiring everybody to record their presentation using their camera, doing something sort of like this, and you find a handful of students, or even just one student is struggling with it. One student's really having a hard time getting that done, right? Or using we'll talk about Flipgrid later, but using Flipgrid for video. I can imagine having a conversation with that kid and saying, listen, if you're having a tough time with that, here are a few other options for you. Why don't you create a slide deck in Google Slides and just script your responses at the bottom? And I'll take that, right? If that's as thorough and I'm not actually assessing your oral presentation skills, I'm assessing whether or not you have an understanding of the content you're presenting, what you've researched, how you synthesize your sources, I'll take that. That's fine. And so I might accept that slide deck. The universal piece, the scalable piece, is instead of just offering that to one kid, offering that option to the entire class. And the results are often tremendous there because it's not just one kid who ends up taking advantage of that. It's every kid with every issue that you weren't aware of. Maybe they're at home and they've got siblings that are screaming like tea kettles in the background, so they're not recording their video in that same kind of a way. They have to do it in the middle of the night. It's a challenge for them, and they're doing everything they can to surmount it without even letting you know. That student would benefit from it.
I think we can build off that in some ways too here, which is most of the conversations I actually have with teachers is kind of whittling down what they actually want to assess. So a lot of times what makes things overwhelming too, and as we get a little bit farther into this, we start talking about the different types of representation and different types of ways of instructing for kids or having kids be able to create products, is that in every single one of these things, the teacher thinks a little bit about what is actually what I want to assess. And am I assessing that or am I assessing something else? Because most of the time we run into problems when we want to assess one thing, but then we actually, to get to that one thing we want to assess, we end up actually assessing like a whole bunch of other different skills. And sometimes like that's important depending on what we really want in a product. But a lot of times it's just because like that's the vehicle that gets us to that skill, or that's the vehicle we're used to getting to that skill. And a kid might be really bad at one part of the product, but very good at what you're trying to assess. And the frustration comes in because they can't do these other things to get to that skill that they know they can do. And what universal design will do is start to break that down. What are you really trying to have a conversation about? What are you really trying to have the student produce? And then once you've boiled that down, then you can say, well, how do you can give that to me in different ways. And I'll be okay with it because I know what I want to assess, and how I get that then doesn't really matter as much.
Yeah, that's so important. That's so important, especially when, you take something, I'm thinking about like biology, and you have the kids write an essay to explain a concept, but if that student struggles with writing, then that essay will likely not reflect their understanding. If what you're trying to truly measure is not their ability to write or to communicate in the English language, but their understanding of that, that content or that concept in biology, then it would behoove you, if you were teaching that class, to offer other ways to demonstrate that knowledge. Yeah, that's so important.
All right, so we're moving, right? Okay.
Yeah. So one thing that we brainstormed when we originally started to put this together, a visual graphic organizer. Right? What if I could populate a graphic organizer that was visual? Could that help that one student? Probably, maybe. And the thing with this is it's an iterative cycle, right? So maybe that graphic organizer is the thing that totally helps that student I'm thinking of in my mind, and it relieves the struggle, and it's great, and it's a home run. But there's a chance that it's not it at all. Perhaps the graphic organizer, as soon as you send that out to that student in the class, that student might say, great, thanks, I've already got something like that. And
right. And I mean, and even if it does work that first time through, you haven't solved all organizational issues for all kids all the time. So and we all know this, that you never really step into the same classroom twice. So there's going to be that. And that's why I think it's when we start looking at this, we start to think about how do we develop a toolkit of things that we can keep going to. And then when it starts to become a thinking process and not a list of all these different things you have to do, then you have a whole bunch of things ready-made for kids who are kind of working with like issues. Or you could design a class that kind of already deals with a lot of those issues right out of the gate, so that you're not wasting time thinking about it later on.
And the last piece here that we already talked about is scaling it. So how do you take that thing, and as Chris mentioned, once you have a toolkit and once it becomes part of the thought process, it's plugging it in, it's considering how it might apply in one situation, and then scaling it. This is my scale.
This is how scale.
So we haven't really explicitly talked about what UDL is yet, and that was intentional. We've been thinking around it. At this point, maybe you have a pretty solid understanding as to where we're going with this. Universal design for learning gets its roots really from universal design and architecture. A really obvious and popular example of that is curb cuts. So what you're looking at on the screen there, that's a curb cut. These became especially popular in the early 90s with the American Disabilities Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, right? But that curb cut serves so much more than that particular group of individuals. It serves so many more functions. Who else uses a curb cut?
Are you waiting for me to say things? Because I would.
That was my wait time.
Who else uses a curb cut? What's really helpful here, I would suggest, like in cities, specifically when you're talking about curb cuts. So you have anybody who's going to be carrying or delivering anything, anybody who's a bike messenger or using a bike, right? Anybody who is walking and talking to somebody else and doesn't want to fall on their face when they're crossing the street.
Yeah.
So all of these things probably are helpful. Very few people look down at their feet when they're walking, waiting to see whether or not the ground is going to go up. So even though it's helping people who are in wheelchairs, there's a whole bunch of other groups of people who are benefiting from this.
Yep. And so I hadn't thought of those first few groups you mentioned there. I hadn't even, first place I went, and it's because probably my situation, I think strollers, right? Like if you've got a stroller, you use the curb cut, right? So the point is it benefits a much wider audience. You would never say only individuals with wheelchairs can use this curb cut. But it makes so much sense that you can design for curb cuts to exist, everywhere, or almost everywhere, make them fairly universal, and to the benefit of society, to the benefit of everyone. You may recognize those curb cuts there. Target, for the most part, has eliminated curb cuts in front of the building. They accomplish the same effect of trying to deter vehicles from smacking into their front doors with those giant, red spheres that they put in front of the building. But if you're pushing a shopping cart in, you can push it in from almost any angle because, that's universal design. They removed the curb. Same deal with many Wegmans. Wegmans is usually the first place I go to for that.
So I want to kind of jump in here and talk about who should be doing the designing and why it should be like a conversation, right? So design is a dialogue between the learner or the user and the designer. And I love using this image because if I describe it to you and I describe the problem, this sounds like such a great way of solving a problem. So this is from a museum. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to create something that looked really aesthetically pleasing, but also was like ADA compliant, right? So how do you get wheelchairs up? And then how do you design something that looks nice, right? So when this was done, they really didn't do much conversation with the actual people who were having the problems. So they developed something that from a user, and as a teacher, I used to do this all the time, where you would like try to solve a problem without actually asking the person about what their problem was, because I felt like I was the teacher, and then therefore I was the educational master in this, and then I would then solve their problem. And I came up with something that looked really good on the surface for me and then was totally unusable for the person, right? And a lot of that just came down to the fact that I wasn't really thinking for them, I was thinking for me and how I would like to do it, right? So in this case, these architects designed something that was kind of interesting where the slope for a wheelchair is way too high. So if you're bringing a wheelchair down and you are not unbelievably strong, somebody is flying down there and smacking into a wall. Also, if you're going to try to walk up, because the way vision works, you get like an aha wall effect. If you don't know what that is, it basically like hides like a wall somewhere, right? So your eyes don't necessarily see the fact that you're not going upstairs anymore, and you trip constantly on the ADA portion of that slope. So here you have people who are trying to design something, but they're not really thinking about the learner, or they're not getting feedback from the learner or the user, and they're creating something that seems like it works for them, and they're creating something that doesn't work for anybody.
It fall.
They fall, right.
So this here,
and you can still scan this. This should still work. So you can still get there.
You can scan it. You can scan the QR code. You can head to udlguidelines.cast.org, or you can take a look at what's on the screen here. Either way, however you want to get to it. These are known as the guidelines, CAST's guidelines for Universal Design for Learning. So what they've essentially done is they have these 3 categories, and you'll see them across the top, and providing multiple means for each of these, whatever we want to call them, categories.
They're like themes, space. Yeah, categories work.
That's those are essentially the guidelines, and it makes a whole lot of sense once you start to consider it organized in this sort of way. So the 3 categories are engagement, representation, and action and expression. So in a nutshell, I mean, we can already start to brainstorm multiple means for engagement. How do you recruit your students' interests? How do you optimize whatever it is that they're learning for individual choice? How do you optimize it for relevance? How do you minimize threats and distractions? And all 3 of these things here, all 3 of these guidelines, they're all very, very different. So if we were considering that problem earlier of some students, a handful of students in the class struggling to get the deadlines in on time. Well, if the barrier is, and this is totally different than what we were discussing earlier, but perhaps, and that's where this ends up being a really helpful, document for brainstorming and for considering multiple angles in, it'll give you like 30 angles or however many guidelines there are into that particular problem, right? So to consider a few, is the barrier to students completing those weekly assignments a matter of there being no individual choice involved, right? Is it just something that they're being boxed into what I'm requiring them to do, and so it just isn't engaging? The engagement isn't there, and perhaps that's it. Could it be that there are threats and distractions? So a distraction these days when everyone is online, there distractions abound, right? If you could give every student a quiet space to work and focus in, you would probably see learning skyrocket, because I imagine that's an issue for
right. And I'm going to jump in here like that. When from our district perspective, when we survey our students, that's one of the hardest, that's one of the things that comes up the most, which is it is hard for me to continue to get the work done, not because I don't want to, but because there are so many things that are tempting me all the time. Yeah. Right. And kids have to learn personal responsibility. That's true. But at the same time, these are barriers that don't exist in a normal classroom setting.
Yeah.
That now exist.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the threats, minimizing threats, sometimes, I want to say often, maybe more often than not, they take the form of things that we don't necessarily recognize as threats. Obviously, when we're giving the assignment, you wouldn't assign something threatening to your students intentionally, but sometimes something like, where we were talking about a Flipgrid, like post a video of yourself explaining this idea or this concept and, share with the class. That can be very threatening for some students if they're not comfortable, speaking, creating a video of themselves. They're not comfortable with the English is their second language, and so they're going to have a tough time doing that. That could be the reason why they're struggling to keep up with your assignments, because maybe they have to re-record it so many times before they feel comfortable with it that they don't do it.
Right. So let me give you an example of this for English language learners that happens a lot, which is actually surprising. Is this. There's a lot of situations where if you have an English language learner population, right, you have a grouping of those people, depending on what type of immigrant community you have, that are failing a subject matter, right? And a lot of districts, and I'm not speaking for every single one because I don't want to overgeneralize, when they look at this problem, right, they assume kids do very poorly who are English language learners in English, right? Like that would make sense. But most of the time they don't. They do poorly in gym. And what it ends up happening is it just turns out that probably if you have English language learners who are coming in there, you're also talking about another grouping, another barrier in that population, which is the ability to have either social issues when it comes to specific types of changing or rules of games or expectations socially. And these are barriers you never think about. So if you're just being a user and you're designing, or you're just being a creator or designer, and you're just creating, you're solving probably problems that may not actually exist at the expense of problems that are real.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And having actually brainstormed, essentially what we did with consider a problem and bringing it through this, this whole lens, in a high school with phys ed teachers. The conversation, and it's interesting because there the conversation started with, I don't know how this is going to apply. Let's think of a problem. Kids aren't changing for gym. Bunch of kids won't change, right? And so as we started to look at this, it was at this exact moment we considered this bullet. Well, what if, think of that one student. Why aren't they changing? Is there something that's a threat? Is it that they are embarrassed? Maybe. Is it that they don't have a change of clothes? Is it that they, whatever it might be, there's someone in the room that makes them uncomfortable. So can you create a situation where that one student has a little more privacy? But the UDL is, instead of only making that accessible to that one kid, make that accessible to everyone. And what happens? Everyone gets changed for gym now. And so, so that's, that's UDL at work. Yeah. And it's less academic there than we've been talking about the past, 20 minutes here, but it just makes just as much sense. Yeah. So as we work down this column here, we won't spend as much time on every single indicator, but it goes from recruiting interest to sustaining effort and persistence to self-regulation. So you can see how it delves, it goes deeper and deeper into the ultimate goal, which is to create expert learners who are purposeful and motivated. And a lot of the stuff we've started to talk about, you'll notice them, down here, like facilitating personal coping skills and strategies. And that's, obviously the deeper or higher level stuff, as opposed to something being a threat. But if it's a threat, then it kind of, then it stops there. It doesn't even go further. Multiple means for representation. The most straightforward way to consider this, and that's often thought of, is multiple ways to intake, to perceive something. So do you assign just the reading? Do you also assign it as, you make the audio version available, or you give students access to a text-to-speech reader? And one of the really nice things about this is, once you give students that gift once, they carry it with them forever. Right. So as soon as you introduce a student to a text-to-speech reader, if they had never experienced that before, then regardless of whether or not their next teacher, instructor, professor, whoever lets them in on that secret, they already are equipped with the tool to start to handle that. And what I found very surprising, it was, I was reading, I think it was either trends, it was a neuroscience article. It was either trends in neuroscience, or it was in mind, brain, and education. But basically it was a study on text to speech in students who were already strong readers as compared to students who had dyslexia. And what they found is that, and this is, again, speaks to the power of universal design, when students were just assigned a reading, who read faster? Obviously, it seems obvious to me, students who didn't have a reading disability. Who had more comprehension? Same deal, right? But when they were given the screen reader, and they used one called Voice Dream Reader, which is important. This comes full circle. So once they use Voice Dream Reader, they found that students with dyslexia read at about the same level as students who did not have dyslexia, right? They caught up, it equalized, right? But students who were already strong readers read even faster and had more, greater comprehension. So that really speaks to the fact that it is there's a universal effect. Why withhold that tool when it's something that could be helpful, not just to students who are dyslexic, but maybe there are students whose eyes get tired, students who get migraines, students who have so much reading to do that is the thing, that is their barrier to reading another article, that they're tired.
Right. And on top of that, as a teacher, and I know that when I deal with teachers a lot, then it doesn't become something special. So you're not giving a kid a leg up. You've just designed your class that way. So now everybody has the opportunity to be able to access that, and everybody benefits from it.
Yeah. And I'm hoping it's still the same because this is like the payoff moment. But it was a pretty interesting moment for me. I went and I looked up the app in the App Store. So it's called Voice Dream Reader. And I was expecting to see, I went to download it and it cost, I think, $10 or $15. And, you know, whenever you see, for me, if I see an app cost $1, it makes me, I go right to the reviews, right? Like, is this really worth $1? So this one, you know, maybe $10, $15. So I started to read the reviews, expecting to see reviews from people who have reading disabilities. That's what I expected. All of the reviews were from law school students, med school students, and they're all right. And they're all saying, you know, these, I have to read the most boring and dry text in the world. Why am I doing this? What am I signed up for? Why am I doing this myself? If it weren't for this app, I wouldn't be able to get through it. And now I'm able to get through everything because it's, you know, it's the tool. And it isn't just being, you know, offered to the one, you know, maybe most obvious use case.
Yeah.
So we won't go through every indicator, but this, you know, that's representation. You can follow that down to providing, you know, options for language and symbols, options for comprehension, and ultimately the goal is to create learners, expert learners who are resourceful and knowledgeable. And the blue column is almost the opposite of the purple column, right? Where the purple is about perception, you know, like consume. Action and expression is about the opposite, right? Creating different options for conveying understanding about something, right? So maybe it's written, maybe it's spoken, maybe it's, you know, I think of this often shows up as like a choice board or as a menu where students can, you know, write the essay or create a documentary or create a podcast or create a group presentation or create a, you know, something like that. And oftentimes in practice that feels like you're doing something like hokey, that's a break. But it isn't necessarily a break. It just may make more sense. It just may be a better way for students to actually be able to convey what they know. Anything else on that, Chris? You think we're good?
I think we're good here. So we move on to the next portion.
So in thinking about what this looks like in practice,
we have given you quite a few examples of how this has worked out in practice, but let's go through a little bit more step-by-step process, right?
Yeah, so I think this is just an interesting thing to share. This is an email.
Love this. I love this.
It's an email that I got.
I keep coming back to this. I love this. Yeah.
It very much speaks to what we were talking about earlier. So a student emailed me who was a great student and who got an A on her first paper, which was a really tough paper, and the subject line was apologies for being disorganized and a mess of a human. And the apology is for missing several deadlines in the past few weeks. Canvas is extremely confusing for me, and despite this class not being my first on Canvas or my first online class, I'm having tremendous difficulty navigating the site. Help. That's basically what this email was. Right? It was like I'm a good student and I'm having a tough time. I don't know what to do. Help. You know, thanks for everything. And so what to be honest, I went back to this this grid, and really I think that's because I've been having so many conversations about UDL at the time, and the thought process was not one that I had before, but it was in this case, what can I do to help this student, and can I make that same thing accessible to everyone? I think before that, my reaction would have been something like, you know, check Canvas. I post everything there.
Right.
You might want to keep a calendar, right? Like the things that we are used to telling our students, especially at the college level, like, you know, organize yourself. But instead, in considering the UDL, what I did is I actually Googled Google Sheets calendar templates and found like 100 of them. This is just the one I decided to use, but it's a Google Sheet. I went in here, I populated the deadlines, and I took the link, I hit share, took the link, and I shared it with that student. And I said, hey, I'm going to populate the deadlines in here as things are assigned, right? So you can have a view-only version of it that will hopefully be helpful to you in terms of managing your, you know, your time, your deadlines for our class. And then I shared that link with the entire class, right? So it's not like I was keeping a calendar only for myself, or that I was sharing my calendar with one student. I took my calendar, this is what I then began to use and update, and I just made it accessible to everybody. And I can't even tell you how surprised, I mean, in retrospect, maybe it makes more sense, but I was surprised by how many students hadn't reached out to me about the issue before, who said, wow, thank you so much for sharing that Google Sheet. I made a copy of it. I'm using it for my other classes. Or I already have something like this in place, but this is really helpful. I'm going to use yours now instead, or I'm going to use yours to populate mine. So, and that makes sense because we have students who are already doing this, and maybe that's what's making them successful or better able to manage their time. But it's just, it's one strategy among, countless
And
that
it,
could
and it
potentially.
alleviates frustration on so many levels. So we're not just even talking about student frustration. I mean, there are so many times, grading or teaching, and you just like you're frustrated. And you're not frustrated because you don't know how to teach or that you don't know your content, or you're just frustrated because there's something happening and you can't see it. And if you can't see it, you can't fix it. So you're kind of like, I don't understand why kids aren't making deadlines. I don't understand why this isn't occurring. And it frustrates you. And you're trying to look for reasons why. And it's, in a lot of cases, if you don't have the right type of tools to help you navigate that, you're just as blind as the kid flying in. And you lose the opportunity to have that type of day where like a whole bunch of kids reach out to you and they're like, this one thing you did that really didn't take any time. Now all of a sudden they're like, thank you so much. I appreciate everything you've done here. Right. And that's a great day. That's a much better day than like being super frustrated that nobody gets their work.
For every assignment. Thank you so much for this research paper.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
But I think that makes, that's a great point. And we've been talking a lot about this, I feel like we keep coming back to my problem, this one problem I had this semester, the organizational piece, but so much of this is about, instruction and, how materials are presented, the intake, all of the different ways, different angles, and then also the opposite, right? How you ask students to produce or show their understanding. So we're starting to run out of time here, but the place we were going to wrap up, if this were in person, would be to take a look at some digital tools as they pertain to each of those three categories, to engagement, to representation, and to action and expression. And if we were together live, we would workshop some of the tools, especially the ones of interest. But what do you think, Chris? Maybe it'll just make sense for us to
I think we'll just go over, highlight one or two tools in each of the sections, talk about why they connect where they are, and that there's a lot of tools that actually kind of span between the different sections because it just depends how they're applied. So I think we keep showing these pictures of the brain on top of everything because that's CAST stuff. So it's probably a good idea to talk a little bit about the neuroscience aspect of this and why those are there. You can learn a lot more about it, like if you go to the CAST website, but they're there because they talk about the different activator portions in the brain and how one leads to the other. So like the nice thing, if you watch some of the videos that CAST provides, is it kind of tells you like how one aspect of this chart will actually reinforce the others, which makes sense, right? Kids who are more engaged probably are also more likely to be creative and more likely to be like self-regulating in your class. Like it just makes sense, but you can get over it. All right. Marc, you want to go with a little bit of the engagement?
Sure. So this, we'll make this slideshow available to you so that you can actually click on all of these items and check out these tools. They're all live links. But menu templates are just a number of like Google Doc templates. Some of them look and feel like restaurant templates, but it's just one way to foster engagement by offering students more choice in a way that is actually, once you see a restaurant template and you're creating your own menu, it's almost like an easier way. It scaffolds the process for us as designers of learning and instruction in terms of thinking how you might slice it up in different ways. Menus do that very well. QR codes are interesting. Padlet is Google Docs, obviously, and Google Forms are great for a number of reasons. Padlet is essentially a digital corkboard where you can basically pin ideas, have nested, are they even nested? Essentially like asynchronous conversations or discussion forums. Back channel is a chat function that can be used. So again, in thinking about how you're trying to engage students, this is in reference to cold calls, right? So how do you get students to participate? And cold calling can be a threat. It's something that freaks a lot of kids out. And we know that if a student feels threatened, they're not going to be on their game. They're not going to be thinking about the content or learning it. They're going to be, either clammed up hoping they're not called on, or laser focused on what they think the right answer, the expected answer might be, but offering students less threatening ways to participate, like through a doc or a form or a Padlet or a back channel chat, or any number of asynchronous means, less threatening means could be helpful. These are a few solid reminder applications. Remind.com, I believe that was previously Remind 101, is a good one. Google Calendar is a good one.
The nice thing about Remind or any of these things, unless you want to set it up for your students, because Google Calendar will do this too if you just get them to get push notifications from the app. But I think we all get frustrated because kids don't check email, right? Like they just don't check email. So like what Remind will do is they'll send it to their phone, which is glued to their face most of the time. So that allows for them to see it.
Yeah, great for that. Yeah. Collaboration, Flipgrid is great for that. If you haven't used Flipgrid yet, then just check it out. Stop whatever you're doing, go and check it out.
Yeah, go to Flipgrid. Yeah.
It's a great tool, especially in the online space for asynchronous video chat.
Right.
Voxer is similar, but it's only audio. They refer themselves, I think, as like a walkie-talkie app.
They're really good for like group collaboration over time.
Yes. Yep. And mastery-oriented feedback. So I know that Canvas has something called mastery paths. Depending on the LMS that you're using, Classcraft I know has something similar to that, which is like a gamified learning management tool. But essentially, what mastery paths are in Canvas is you can have students, take a quiz or an assessment or an assignment, and then depending on how they do, send them automatically to a different module, right? So you might have students who take this, your first day assessment, first day quiz, and if they score between a 95 and 100, they are routed to this assignment next, or this module next. If they score between 70 and the 95, maybe they're where you expect them to be, and you send them here. If they score below a 70, then they receive something else that's maybe more targeted to remediating certain skills, or But mastery tracks, something you can do manually or something you can actually do with most LMSs. I know Canvas does it for sure. Okay, here's some tools for representation.
So we're talking a little bit about, so some kids, it just becomes that it's not a content issue or even really a thinking issue. It's just that they have trouble decoding what's in front of them. So, I mean, this makes a lot of sense, right? Like, if you've ever traveled and you've been, you've tried to navigate a place where you don't speak the language, right? You start to perpetually feel like you feel like you're 5 years old, right? Because you're constantly unable to do the type of skills that you really can do, because everything to you just doesn't make sense, right? And we have a lot of students that deal with a sliding gauge of those types of issues. So and I think we all know that intuitively. It's not like you have dyslexia or you don't, right? There's this sliding scale where you hit a certain threshold and all of a sudden they're like, okay, we're going to classify this. But there's a lot of kids in that gray area between like perfectly able to decode everything and dyslexic, right? I have a son who has dyspraxia, and it's like he has a lot of difficulty being able to recall words of that nature. But if it's in front of him, he can manipulate it without a problem. So there's these different types of things with different types of representation that allow you to cut through to the skill you actually want to assess. So this could be done in certain things, like you have open dyslexic font, which does a lot of that, and the dyslexic font portions generally work with other types of neurological issues that are kind of like that too. So it's fun to kind of play around with that. There's screen readers, different types of ones that will read text out loud. And allow a student to be able to both listen and read along, which it works for all types of students. You have closed captions. Actually, in a lot of videos, what we don't really, which helps for a lot of students, is that a lot of kids actually have trouble getting out background noise. And as videos try to become more entertaining to hold attention, they actually become more distracting for a large portion of students. So you think you're giving them this kind of great video, and in turn, they just can't focus on what's important. And it gets really frustrating for you because you're like, why didn't you see that? That's obviously the main point. And the problem is that like there's so many things happening that they can't quite cut through it.
Too much ukulele.
Yeah. AR and VR. You can embed a kid in certain areas. You can allow them, you can focus their attention that way in some ways. Screencasting is great. So, and there's a lot of free ones out there. So if you screencast a lecture, you don't have to screencast your whole lecture. Just basically boil down the most important things to 5-minute video and allow the kid to be able to access that. And then those are the main points and they come back. So you don't have to feel like you're doing a lot of extra work, and then you can reuse those and it allows a kid to continuously go back.
Yeah. And I think, something I always come back to is that this really serves students at every end of this, every kid. Like I think of in high school land, we sometimes are critical of students who take, very, very rigorous courses. So you're taking 6 AP courses. Sometimes the reaction is, well, you've done this to yourself, and how are you going to keep up with the readings? You can't, right? And when students go to college or they go to like law school or med school, they have more to do, and we're not critical of them at that point. We reward them and we say, wow, isn't that great? But the same strategies that make sense at those levels make sense at the high school level and, at every level. So that audio book that used to be something reserved only for students who required, audio assistance while reading, that we now, if you take a look at the reviews in some of those apps, audio is used at med school and law school to keep up. The answer for our, even our high school students who are taking rigorous, very rigorous, coursework isn't don't exercise, do more reading. It's right. See how you can do both. See, can you take that article, get an MP3 version of it and listen to it while you go for a jog, and then, reread it again later if you can. So the point is that there is, something there for everyone. Even like I think of Spritz. Spritz isn't the right tool. Spritz is interesting. I mean, who knows? It might be for some people. What Spritz does is it will just, at like up to, 700 words a minute, just flash text on a screen. And some people find that they're able to, to actually comprehend it at those speeds. But I personally, in shadowing a student, I shadowed a student through a school day. I've done it a few times, but there's one in particular that comes to mind because she had such a rigorous schedule. And when it came time and you forget how, when you're a student, you are taking the most challenging courses at the like outskirts of your ability level. It's challenge after challenge after challenge, right? You don't take algebra 1 once you've passed algebra 2. You're always at like your limits. And so by lunchtime, I was exhausted, and she was like, "Listen, I have to go to the library." I said, "We're not going to eat lunch." She said, "No, I have to watch this YouTube video. I want to study for." For AP US history. So instead, she went to the library and she watched these YouTube videos at 2x speed, right? So now that for me was totally menacing, but I can see why a number of students would like to listen to something at 2x speed. For her, it was just intake, right? Like pure, I don't have a lot of time. This is the time for me to study this. This is how I'm going to do it. But I can imagine if you're bored by the content and you don't want to sit there and like I know I don't have the attention for it. I'd rather have it in 10 minutes than sit here for 20. That's another way to, to frame it and to use that kind of a tool. And this is the third bucket that we've got, which is digital tools for action and expression.
So I think what's really interesting here, again, kind of coming back to, how a student is going to demonstrate their understanding. Some students get really, a lot of students have interesting concepts that are in their heads and have difficulty being able to actually put them into another type of format, right? So, and this, for kids to make a video or to piece things together required enormous amount of skills of being able to break down main points, being able to connect main concepts, right? And giving those kids those options to be able to do it will allow them to shine. And I think sometimes we have this weird thing where we keep going into like, well, they're this type of learner or that type of learner. And that's not really the case. The case here is they just have this really great idea. And maybe they could write it and it would be okay. But the way they really comprehend it is they want to be able to demonstrate to you how they can manifest the use of color and music and all kinds of other things to put in to give you this amazing product that they, or at least what they believe is an amazing product to demonstrate their understanding. Allowing them to do that allows them to shine their full understanding and conception of a topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, you know, when you allow that, kids have the opportunity to be able to kind of really truly be able to show what they know, and not even from a situation of deficiency. Really good kids who do a really good essay can also do an amazing movie or write you an amazing song if it fits the parameters of what you want to assess.
Yep. Yep. That's what, I mean, that's always what it comes down to, right? What are the objectives? What are you actually trying to?
Right. What do you want?
Yes. Yep. Yep. So these tools will be there for you.
Mhm.
This is our last slide, which is our let's take a moment to reflect slide. If we were all here together, we would ask you to think of one way you might incorporate this UDL framework into your...
Turn, look into a mirror.
Yes, talk to yourself. you like that? Talk to yourself about how UDL, you know, might affect things for you. Something I think of in reflecting on this now, you know, UDL is hard to do. I think the most manageable way to do it, to hold on to your sanity, is to do one thing at a time, to try one strategy at a time. And sometimes, you know, we have to acknowledge that it can be time consuming. It can be very difficult to do well. If we even consider this presentation where so much is out of our control, right? We're recording this now together via Zoom. We're going to send it to Rutgers. It's going to be, you know, they're going to do post-production on it. You're going to ultimately, if you're watching this, you're viewing something that has, you know, changed hands so many times.
Right.
If we wanted this to be as universally accessible as possible, you know, I'm not even sure how much of that is even plausible. Will there be closed captions? So much depends on where, you know, where it's uploaded. If it's on YouTube, you might see a little closed caption button. So it's possible that you'll be able to do that. Can you just listen to this instead of watching us? Is the benefit, you know, equal? Should we provide you with a transcript as well? I mean, there's a rabbit hole that you can go down where we could probably spend the next month trying to create resources to make this as accessible as possible for anyone who might, you know, possibly participate and watch. So it's, you know, it can be challenging. It can be a daunting task. You know, so one step at a time, I think. What do you think, Chris?
No, I agree. And I think, you know, the first thing to do is you're remember, you're not trying to create something, you're trying to create one thing that harvests a lot of kids, a lot of learners, right? Not necessarily something that hits every single learner. And the nice thing about UDL, and as you start to kind of break it apart and start to use it, is you'll find out that, like, by giving kids a little bit more freedom and options, they do that hard work for you. They will find the thing that will destroy the barrier for them to give you what they want, instead of you having to anticipate what that barrier is all the time. So that is where I'm done after that. Like, I've got nothing else to say.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
I'm going to go hit up that palm tree behind me and wade in the water.
Yes, I'll be here with my green screen.
All right.
I was going to change my background, but I won't. All right, so that's it, I guess. Thank you, everyone, for being for participating in the session, for being here with us virtually, and have a great day. Enjoy the conference.